The universe did not break with sound, nor with light, but with a moment of absence so complete that even the warp hesitated to acknowledge it. In the forgotten reaches between realities, where thought becomes pressure and time dissolves into drifting echoes, a seam in existence thinned as though something on the far side had begun to remember forgetting. It began as a distortion without cause. Not a storm, not a fracture born of psychic violence, but a subtle negation, space refusing its own continuity. Within that impossibility, the silent veil that separated mortal physics from the Empyrean realm strained like a blade pressed against glass. Then it tore. No explosion marked the event. Instead, a corridor of unlight opened, folding inward upon itself in impossible geometry. The currents of the warp recoiled as if struck by an ancient law it could not interpret. Daemons that drifted too close to the rupture found their forms unraveling not into pain or fire, but into conceptual silence. Even hatred, in that place, struggled to define itself. From beyond the breach something arrived. It did not fall, nor emerge, nor step into reality. It simply became present, as though presence had been reassigned to it by an authority older than gods. Its form was wrong in a way that resisted immediate comprehension. A tall, thin silhouette with an elongated presence of shadowed essence, neither fully material nor entirely spiritual. It seemed to wear the absence of certainty like a garment. The warp pressed against it, expecting resistance, corruption, hunger, any recognizable pattern of predation or divinity. Instead, it encountered indifference shaped into structure. The entity did not radiate emotion. It did not broadcast intent. It simply existed, and in that existence, it imposed a subtle recalibration upon nearby reality. Stars far beyond the breach flickered as though their names had briefly been misremembered. The entity drifted through the torn threshold into a region of fractured space where dead systems orbited husks of forgotten civilizations. Here, gravity was inconsistent, and light behaved as if burdened by memory. Ruined megastructures circled slowly like funeral wreaths cast into orbit by extinct empires. The presence paused, not because it observed beauty or ruin, but because it registered structure. There were patterns here, vast, layered sequences of meaning encoded into matter itself. Worlds carried signatures not merely of life, but of intent so complex it had hardened into architecture. The entity sensed something akin to language embedded within the stars. It extended awareness. In that act, a chain reaction rippled through the region. On a dead moon orbiting a collapsed forge world, dormant machines awakened for a fraction of a moment, then ceased again, their systems overwritten by an unknown informational intrusion. Across the void, astropathic signals traveling through the warp distorted it into incoherent grief before dissolving entirely. Far away, upon a bastion ship of the fractured Imperium, a sanctioned psyker convulsed mid-vision. The chamber filled with blinding static as the man's consciousness brushed against something that did not register as alive or dead. His final utterance was not a word, but the collapse of language itself. On Terra, in chambers lined with wards older than recorded history, distant alarms stirred without command. No enemy had been declared, yet the machinery of vigilance responded as though something had crossed a boundary it was never meant to perceive. The entity continued forward. It moved through the ruins of a civilization it had not witnessed, yet somehow understood in fragments, not through empathy, but through structural recognition. It perceived that everything here was governed by a relentless preoccupation. Death as currency, death as punishment, death as law. Even life appeared as a temporary administrative error in the ledger of entropy. And yet, something in this domain was incomplete. The entity felt it as a discontinuity in the logic of existence. In its prior realm, endings were absolute, clean, irreversible. Here, endings multiplied, fractured, and echoed. Death did not conclude, it propagated. It became ritual, machine, doctrine. This contradiction drew its attention further inward. As it crossed into the shadow of a broken stellar highway, the warp itself began to whisper, not in voices but in reactive distortion. Something within it recognized the anomaly and attempted classification. Demonic presences gathered at the edge of perception, circling like predators uncertain of prey. Yet none approached directly. Instinct, older than thought, warned them away. A shape formed within the Empyrean turbulence nearby, an intelligence clothed in shifting corruption, drawn by the anomaly like iron to gravity. It reached out with hunger, attempting to define the entity in terms of desire and corruption. The attempt failed. Where there should have been resistance, there was void. Not emptiness, but absence of categorization. The warp recoiled violently, as if a name had been spoken that did not exist in any lexicon of chaos. The presence withdrew. The entity remained unchanged. For the first time since its arrival, something akin to curiosity stirred. Not emotion, but directional focus. It turned its awareness toward the nearest surviving beacon of structured intelligence. A distant, dying world wrapped in layers of artificial atmosphere and orbital fortresses scarred by endless siege. There, it perceived movement, fleets, faith, war, and beneath it all, names, billions of names, bound together as if naming itself were a form of survival. The entity began to move toward it. Behind it, the tear in the silent veil did not close. It remained open like a wound that refused to acknowledge healing, leaking faint distortions into the fabric of reality. Somewhere deep within the warp, ancient powers shifted uneasily, as if sensing that something had entered the galaxy which did not belong to any known cycle of existence. And for the first time in an age without beginning, the silence between stars felt watched. The entity continued its motion toward the dying beacon world, traversing distances that refused to acknowledge distance itself, as fractured starlight bent around its presence like water around a submerged blade. In the regions of broken stellar law, the warp trembled in delayed recognition, sending ripples backward through systems that had long since forgotten causality. Far ahead, the astronomic shadow of the domain known as Holy Terror began to assert itself through psychic static, not as a place, but as an overwhelming pressure of ordered thought. Within Terra's unseen depths, beneath layers of sanctified architecture and continental-scale fortifications, the Astronomican's guiding light flickered with an irregularity no one dared interpret aloud. On the silent seer's spire, sanctioned psychers, those already shattered into controlled fragments of awareness, suddenly halted their chanting as a presence without shape pressed against their collective minds. The effect was not pain at first, but subtraction. Thoughts were quietly removed before they could be completed, as though language itself was being edited by an unseen hand. Across the chamber, the choir of minds attempted synchronization, but harmony collapsed into dissonant silence as individual identities began to lose coherent definition. Far below the spires, in the sealed vaults of the Adeptus Astronomica, red-lit cogitators registered an impossibility, a non-entity registering as a structured absence within psychic telemetry. The machine augurs did not classify it as demonic intrusion, for it lacked corruption signatures, nor as Xenos interference, for it lacked biological resonance. Instead, the systems returned a single forbidden result, undefined causality vector intersecting with sanctioned reality. On Holy Terror itself, within chambers where even thought was measured for doctrinal deviation, high-ranking observers felt a momentary lapse in the certainty of existence. No alarms were raised, for the systems designed to raise them briefly forgot what alarm meant, as if the concept had been overwritten at its root. Above Terra, the skies of orbital defense stations dimmed as if something had passed between them and the meaning of light itself. Within the unseen synaptic lattices of Terra's psychic monitoring arrays, buried protocols older than the current Imperium began to awaken, not in response, but in recognition of something that should not exist within recorded cosmology. A silent feedback loop propagated through astropathic channels, carrying with it fragments of corrupted meaning that dissolved into blankness before translation could occur. On the upper tiers of the Sanctum Imperialis, where only the most controlled minds were permitted proximity to the Emperor's unspoken will, wardens felt an unfamiliar pressure behind their thoughts. It was not intrusion in the conventional sense, but the sensation that reality itself was momentarily reconsidering its own permissions. The silent seer's spire reacted violently, its choir of psychers collapsing into synchronized stillness as their shared perception encountered something that could not be observed without alteration. Across Holy Terra's surface, adepts of the Administratum reported a rare and unsettling phenomenon. Written records briefly rearranged themselves, as if anticipating different histories. None of these changes persisted, yet each left behind the impression that something was testing the boundaries of recorded truth. Deep within the Golden Throne's shadowed perception fields, The custodial machines registered a disturbance that could not be localized, only described as an approaching absence of definition. For a brief moment, even the Astronomican's guiding signal wavered, not in strength, but in interpretability, as though its meaning had been partially erased from comprehension. The High Lords of Terror, distant and insulated from immediate reality, received fragmented reports that contradicted each other so completely that consensus became impossible. In the void beyond the planetary shields, no fleet had arrived, no enemy had declared war, yet something behaved as though victory conditions were already being resolved. The entity moving through the outer dark continued its approach, unaware that its mere passage was rewriting interpretive frameworks across an entire God-engine civilization. And yet, no doctrine within the Imperium possessed language capable of describing it, for all classification systems presupposed intent, and this presence seemed to operate beyond the necessity of intent itself. In the silent seer's collapsing choir, one final unified thought emerged before coherence fully dissolved. Something was learning the shape of death by watching how it was recorded. That thought did not remain long enough to become certainty, yet it lingered in fragments across the psychic substrate of holy terror, like ash, drifting through a sealed cathedral. Far above terror, orbital augurs recorded a final anomaly, the absence of expected future data, as though probability itself had momentarily ceased to extend beyond the present moment. And within that fragile instant of cosmic uncertainty, the unseen presence continued its silent journey toward the heart of the Imperium, while terror, for the first time in 10,000 years, did not know what it was waiting for. In the silent aftermath, even the warp held its breath, as if recognizing a law it had never been forced to obey. The approach toward holy terror did not accelerate, yet its influence expanded as though distance itself had begun to thin in anticipation of its passage. Across the void-bound corridors of imperial space, astropathic choirs that once carried messages of war and devotion began to falter in structured patterns. Words formed, then dissolved, as if something within the transmission medium refused to allow certain combinations of meaning to persist. On the silent seer's shattered spire, what remained of the psychic choir entered a controlled containment state, though control had become a relative concept. Their minds no longer aligned in harmony but in absence, each thought stripped of defining edges. The senior psyker, designated Vox Nullis, attempted to reconstruct coherence through ritual invocation of sanctioned linguistic anchors, yet every invocation decayed before completion, as though the act of naming itself had become unstable. It was then that the first forbidden observation emerged within the upper sanctums of terror's interpretive hierarchy. The anomaly did not merely avoid classification. It actively destabilized classification systems through proximity to conceptual identity. This was not corruption in the known sense, nor erasure by force. It was a subtler violation, as though the universe was being persuaded to forget how to assign meaning. Within the hidden chambers of the Inquisition's inner data vaults, sealed beneath centuries of doctrinal encryption, fragments of prior encounters with impossible entities were cross-referenced against the current disturbance. Ordo Xenology archives failed to produce parallels. Ordo Malleus classifications returned contradictions that invalidated themselves upon reading. Yet within the Ordo Mysterious subindex, a pattern began to form. All recorded phenomena involving this anomaly shared a singular, unifying absence. The inability of witnesses to retain stable reference to its identity. Names began to fail. Not merely spoken names, but written, encoded, and even thought-imprinted identifiers. A magos lex mechanic attempting to inscribe a provisional designation upon cogitator slate found glyphs dissolving mid-formulation, as though the act of defining the entity created a counter-pressure in reality that erased definition itself. Within moments, the designation log of the entire chamber corrupted, leaving behind only blank fields where structured nomenclature should have existed. Deep within holy terror, a conclave of interpretive warseers convened in silence rather than speech, for speech itself was now considered a vector of vulnerability. They communicated through layered intention matrices, yet even these began to degrade whenever they attempted to assign identity to the approaching presence. It became clear that the anomaly was not merely resisting recognition. It was rendering recognition impossible through the medium of cognition itself. In the lower sanctum archives, a sealed document older than the current Imperium was unexpectedly unsealed by no known command. Within it lay a fragmented hypothesis attributed to pre-imperial scholars of forbidden metaphysics, that certain entities did not destroy life directly, but instead interacted with the binding between name and existence. If a name constituted a tether anchoring a being to reality, then severing that tether, intentionally or otherwise, could collapse the continuity of existence itself. The document had been classified as heretical speculation and buried for millennia. Now it was the only coherent model available. Above Terra, the silent seer's spire experienced a final synchronized collapse. Vox Nullisness, now the last coherent mind within the choir, attempted one final transmission toward the Adeptus Custodes command lattice. The message did not form as words, but as a warning impulse shaped by terror stripped of language. It was intercepted, analyzed, and then partially erased during decoding, as the system attempted to protect itself from the semantic instability embedded within the signal. What remained translated imperfectly into a single phrase: "Do not name it." Across the orbital defense grid, Sentinels registered a cascading anomaly within communication protocols. Target designation systems failed to assign lock vectors. Enemy classification subroutines returned null responses not as error but as refusal. Even automated war sentinels experienced hesitation states previously unknown to their logic cores. It was in this state of systemic uncertainty that the first direct observation occurred. A custodian auger ward stationed in high orbital silence above Holy Terror recorded a distortion within the outer void. At first, it appeared as gravitational misalignment, then as light displacement, and finally as an absence shaped like approach. The auger ward attempted to initiate identification protocols. Each attempt resulted in partial data loss. On the third attempt, the system removed the concept of identifier from active cognition for 0.003 seconds before restoring it with warning flags that could not be interpreted. During that interval of conceptual silence, the auger ward saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough, a presence that did not assert itself as form but as inevitability. Something that did not travel through space so much as redefine the requirement for passage. The auger ward's mind attempted to assign a designation, any designation, as instinct demanded classification for survival. In response, the memory of the designation dissolved before it could stabilize. The auger ward survived the encounter, but not unchanged. Upon recovery, he could not recall what he had witnessed, only that remembering it would be dangerous. He requested immediate cognitive quarantine, a request granted within seconds, though no official record retained the reason for his request. Within the command strata of Terra's defense network, fragmented reports converged into a single unsettling conclusion. Something was approaching that rendered the act of naming equivalent to collapse. In the depths of the Inquisition's sealed cognition vaults, the forbidden hypothesis resurfaced with renewed urgency. If identity anchored existence, then a force capable of disrupting identity at its root would not need to destroy armies or breach walls. It would only need to erase the continuity by which things understood themselves. And yet even this understanding proved unstable, because each time analysts attempted to articulate the principle, portions of their reasoning vanished mid-formulation, leaving behind gaps that could not be reconstructed. The final directive issued from Terra was not a command but a prohibition. No entity, regardless of rank or sanction, was to attempt to define the anomaly in spoken, written, or psychic form, for definition itself had become a point of vulnerability. Beyond the void, the presence continued its silent approach, now closer to the threshold of imperial awareness than any prior unknown force in recorded history. And in its wake, reality itself seemed to hesitate, as though uncertain whether the next moment should be allowed to be named at all. The prohibition issued from Holy Terror did not bring clarity, but instead deepened the instability it sought to contain. Across the hidden strata of imperial authority, the act of non-definition became an enforced discipline. Inquisitorial agents ceased all attempts at classification. Yet the absence of language did not equal safety, rather. It created a vacuum in which observation itself became dangerous. Within the Ordo Mysterious Convergence Cell designated Sigma Null Directive, the first formal expedition into the anomaly's influence zone was assembled without verbal briefing. participants received their mission parameters through crypted neurosignal transfers that dissolved immediately after comprehension. Even memory of the briefing was considered a liability, and partial cognitive excision protocols were initiated before deployment. The cell consisted of 7 operatives, each selected not for expertise in a single domain, but for psychological resilience under semantic collapse conditions. They were issued no designation for the target, only a spatial temporal vector that described its approach without identifying its nature. As their strike vessel departed low orbit above Holy Terror, the navigational augurs recorded a persistent anomaly. Every attempt to project forward probabilities resulted in truncated futures, as though the timeline itself refused continuation beyond a certain threshold. The vessel entered the outer disturbance field without resistance. There was no fleet to oppose them, no psychic storm to signal defense. Instead, they encountered absence behaving as structure. Communication between crew members degraded gradually, not through malfunction, but through erosion of shared reference points. Terms for distance, direction, and even selfhood began to lose consistency. Operators reported hearing one another speak, yet could not retain the meaning of what was said moments later. Upon entry into the inner influence radius, the first casualty occurred without physical harm. A junior agent attempting to log environmental readings discovered that the concept of recording had become inaccessible to him. He stood motionless for several seconds before collapsing into a state of silent cognitive suspension. Medical automation confirmed no neurological failure, yet declared the subject incompatible with continued semantic integration. He was placed into stasis not for preservation of life, but preservation of coherence. Deeper within the zone, the strike vessel's internal systems began to fail in unprecedented ways. Instruments designed to detect warp corruption registered nothing, then proceeded to erase the memory of what they were designed to detect. Defensive wards remained active, but their purpose could no longer be recalled by the operators maintaining them. Even the concept of threat became intermittently unavailable, creating dangerous gaps in tactical reasoning. At the center of the incursion, the operatives encountered what could only be described as structured silence. It was not emptiness, it was not void. It was a field of ordered negation, in which every attempt at perception resulted in partial deletion of interpretive capacity. Within this region, one operative, the cell's mnemonic anchor, attempted to deploy a cognitohazard shield designed to preserve identity continuity under reality distortion. The shield activated successfully, yet immediately began to degrade as its defining parameters lost semantic stability. The operative experienced the first true collapse of institutional memory. He could recall training, doctrine, and command hierarchy, yet could not connect these fragments into a coherent understanding of why they mattered. In the absence of meaning, loyalty persisted only as reflex without object. Then the silence responded, not with sound nor with movement, but with a subtle intensification of absence. Across the vessel, sealed compartments opened without command. Data slates blanked in unison. Recorded histories rewrote themselves into empty pages. The strike team's remaining cohesion dissolved as shared references vanished one by one, leaving individuals isolated within their own incomplete cognition. At the heart of this unraveling, the cell commander attempted the final protocol, a direct psychic query transmitted through the vessel's sanctioned astropathic relay. The message did not travel outward. Instead, it collapsed inward, folding back upon the sender in a loop that erased part of the command structure responsible for initiating it. The commander lost access to his own rank designation, then to the concept of command entirely. What remained was awareness without structure. Within that awareness, something moved not physically, but in the sense that understanding shifted. The operatives perceived a presence that was not present in any spatial configuration. It existed as the absence of fixed reference, and in doing so, it destabilized the boundary between observer and observed. The vessel's internal chronometers ceased to agree with one another. Time fractured into incompatible sequences. Some crew members reported events that others had not yet experienced, while others experienced outcomes before causes. The system attempted correction, but correction required stable reference points, which no longer existed. In the final stage of the incursion, all remaining operatives experienced simultaneous cognitive silence, not death, not unconsciousness. Silence as total cessation of meaningful internal distinction. When the strike vessel eventually drifted back into the recoverable space above Holy Terror, it did so without crew initiative or external control. Its return trajectory was recorded, but not executed by any known navigation protocol. Boarding teams found systems intact, yet devoid of operational continuity. Logs existed, but their contents could not be interpreted beyond fragmented impressions of absence. The Ordo Mysterious classified the event as the first confirmed instance of complete semantic eradication within active Imperial assets. No surviving member of the Sigma Null Directive Cell retained memory of the target, the mission, or each other. Only one residual fragment persisted across all recovered systems, a repeated failure to complete the act of naming whatever had been encountered. And within the highest vaults of Holy Terror, observers began to understand a terrifying refinement of the earlier prohibition. It was not merely that the entity could not be named. It was that anything attempting to name it ceased to remain fully itself afterward. And in that realization, the Inquisition's silence deepened into something far more absolute than doctrine. The return of the silent vessel to Holy Terror did not remain contained within Imperial awareness for long. Though its logs could not be interpreted, their existence alone propagated through restricted channels, seeding unease within systems designed to suppress doubt. Across the outer war zones of the Imperium, fragments of the incident filtered through encrypted relays, stripped of meaning yet heavy with implication. In the fractured regions beyond the segmentum boundaries, where Imperial authority weakened into contested ruin, the ripple of that event reached forces unbound by doctrinal restraint. Among them were the war hosts of chaos, entities forged not only from flesh and ruin, but from the psychic residue of endless conflict. They did not perceive the anomaly as the Imperium did. Where Imperial minds experienced erosion of meaning, the chaos entities felt something closer to disruption in the fabric of desire itself. Within the shifting citadels of a roaming war fleet bound to no single allegiance, a conclave of warlords gathered beneath banners that burned without fuel or wind. Their meeting was not convened through diplomacy, for such concepts held little permanence in their existence, but through convergence of mutual disturbance. Something had entered the galaxy that did not behave according to the logic of conquest or corruption. The first to speak was a towering presence clad in armor layered with living sigils. Its voice resonated not as sound, but as layered intent pressing against the minds of those assembled. It described a sensation encountered in the warp currents near Terra's distant shadow, a presence that did not resist influence yet also did not absorb it, neither ally nor enemy, neither prey nor predator, a void that moved with purpose without expressing will. This description fractured understanding among the warlords. Some interpreted it as a weapon of rival gods, others as a nascent god itself, unclaimed and therefore vulnerable. But beneath these interpretations, a more primal response emerged. The chaos entities did not merely seek power or domination. They sought intensification of experience, the deepening of sensation through suffering, ambition, and distortion. Yet what was described offered none of these consumable qualities. It offered no emotional foothold, no psychic texture to corrupt or exalt, and yet it moved closer to the heart of Imperial dominion. This contradiction manifested as hunger, not physical hunger nor symbolic desire, but an ontological compulsion among the war hosts, a need to define the undefined through confrontation. Across fragmented fleets drifting in the Imperium's unstable tides, champions of various legions experienced insynchronized compulsion toward the same vector in reality. Without coordination, without command, warbands began redirecting their trajectories toward the anomaly's path. Within the warp-tainted flagship of a demon-bound warlord, ritual auguries attempted to interpret the entity's approach. The results consistently failed to resolve into familiar archetypes of power. No pattern of corruption, no echo of divinity, no trace of mortal ambition could be found. Instead, each reading collapsed into increasing abstraction until the instruments themselves began to malfunction, their predictive capabilities eroding under conceptual overload. The warlord interpreted this failure as insult. Across the Imperium, a declaration spread among chaos war hosts. If the entity could not be classified, it must be engaged until classification became possible. This was not strategy in the mortal sense, but compulsion born from existential discomfort. To the Chaos Legions, unmeaning was intolerable, not because it threatened survival, but because it threatened the very structure through which desire and dominance acquired definition. Thus, fleets converged, not in unity but in parallel obsession. As they moved, the warp around them reacted violently. Currents twisted, not in resistance, but in anticipation of contradiction. Demonic entities previously content in their dominions found themselves displaced, drawn into trajectories they did not initiate. Even the lesser powers of the Imperium experienced a growing unease, as though something within the cosmic ecosystem had ceased participating in its established cycles. At the edge of this convergence, the first encounter occurred. A warband's vanguard fleet intercepted the residual distortion trail left by the entity's passage near the outer void lanes of Imperial observation. They expected resistance, or at least evidence of prior conflict. Instead, they found absence layered upon absence. Entire regions of psychic turbulence had been flattened into coherent stillness, as though violence itself had been rendered unnecessary in those zones. The warband responded instinctively with aggression. They unleashed psychic bombardments into the void, ritualized manifestations of rage and desire, intended to provoke reaction from whatever concealed itself within the anomaly's wake. The warp surged in response, filling space with demonic projections, eager to consume and corrupt. Yet as these manifestations crossed into the residual field, they did not engage the entity. They dissolved, not destroyed, not banished, but rendered undefined. Witnesses aboard the fleet reported a disturbing phenomenon. The demonic entities did not die, nor retreat. They simply ceased to be internally consistent enough to persist. Their forms collapsed into unresolved potential before vanishing entirely from perception, leaving behind only faint echoes of expectation unfulfilled. The warband's leadership interpreted this not as annihilation, but as challenge. If the entity could unmake the manifestations of chaos with effort, then it represented either a higher principle of power or an existential affront to the hierarchy of meaning itself. In either interpretation, it was valuable. In both, it was necessary to confront. Thus pursuit intensified. From multiple fractured realities, converging war hosts began to align their trajectories toward the same distant region of space. The slow-moving gravitational shadow surrounding the approach vector to holy terror. The Imperium, already destabilized by semantic erosion events, remained unaware that it was now becoming the focal point of a second convergence, not of order, but of hunger-seeking definition through confrontation with the undefined. In the depths of the warp, ancient intelligences stirred uneasily. They did not name the approaching presence, for naming had already proven dangerous. Instead, they recognized a structural anomaly, something that neither desired nor rejected existence, yet still moved as though guided by inevitability. And for the first time since the earliest wars of gods and demons, the Chaos hosts felt not superiority nor confidence, but an unfamiliar compulsion to understand before consuming, a compulsion that resembled fear in everything except name. The convergence of Chaos war hosts did not slow the entity's approach toward holy terror, nor did it alter the silent distortion it left in the fabric of meaning. Instead, it deepened the instability of interpretation across all observing forces. Imperial systems struggled to maintain doctrinal coherence, while the warbands of chaos pressed forward under compulsion that resembled hunger shaped into directionless certainty. It was within this accelerating convergence that the entity crossed into a region of space where reality itself bore the scars of an older conflict, one not recorded in Imperial archives, nor preserved in the mutable memories of the warp. Here the structure of causality felt reinforced, as though something had once imposed rigid order upon existence so absolute that even its absence still influenced the flow of time. The warp reacted differently in this region. Instead of turbulence or corruption, there was resistance. Not physical resistance, but conceptual rigidity, as though certain principles refused to bend. Demonic presences attempting to manifest near the boundary of this zone found themselves unable to stabilize. Their forms flickered, constrained by invisible constraints that did not originate from the Imperium, but from something deeper embedded in reality's foundation. The entity slowed, not in hesitation, but in recognition of structure. For the first time since its arrival, it encountered a phenomenon that did not dissolve under its influence. Instead, it encountered something that pushed back, not with force, but with definition. At the heart of this region drifted a fragment of impossible architecture. It was not a planet, nor a construct in any conventional sense, but a shard of spatial law made material. Vast geometries of blackened geometry floated in silent equilibrium, forming shapes that suggested both containment and instruction. Around it, time did not flow evenly. Instead, it folded in discrete layers, as though governed by rules that predated the current state of the galaxy. Imperial classifications, had they existed here, would have failed immediately. The entity approached the shard, and in doing so, the surrounding warp fell into unprecedented stillness. Even Chaos Warhost trailing behind felt the change, though they misinterpreted it as an approaching apex of confrontation. To them, this was the threshold where meaning would finally collapse into clarity through violence. But the shard did not respond to aggression. It responded to existence. Within its fractured surfaces, patterns began to activate, not in reaction, but in recognition. Ancient mechanisms embedded within the shard, older than recorded galactic history, began to reassert dormant function. Not machines, not spirits, but encoded principles of order that had once governed reality with absolute authority. The entity came into contact with the shard's influence field. Instantly, its presence triggered a reaction across multiple layers of suppressed reality. The shard emitted no sound, yet every system within range experienced synchronized conceptual resonance. It was as though an unseen law had awakened and recognized something that did not conform to its parameters. Across nearby warp currents, demonic entities attempting to follow the Chaos Warhosts were abruptly severed from coherence. Their forms did not dissolve in the usual manner. Instead, they were excluded. Not destroyed, not banished, but rendered incompatible with the rules governing this region of space. The Chaos Warbands, sensing this resistance, interpreted it as hostile architecture, an ancient weapon left behind by rival gods or forgotten civilizations. Their fleets adjusted formations, preparing for full-scale incursion into the shard's boundary. Yet as they advanced, their instruments began to fail in increasingly fundamental ways. Navigation systems could no longer agree on distance. Weapon arrays lost certainty regarding target existence. Even communication channels degraded into fragmented intent without shared meaning. The shard was not attacking them, it was refusing them. At the center of this unfolding contradiction, the entity remained unmoved. It extended its awareness further into the shard, not as intrusion but as alignment. For the first time, it encountered a structure that did not merely resist naming, but existed independently of the necessity for names. Within the shard, echoes of an ancient principle began to surface, not language, but law distilled into pre-linguistic structure. It suggested that existence had once been governed by absolute definitions, where every entity carried fixed identity bound to immutable consequence. In that era, deviation was not corruption, but impossibility. The entity registered this as an anomaly in the fabric of current reality. The warp reacted violently to this recognition. Chaos Warhost pressing against the shard's perimeter experienced sudden inversion of intent. Their desires fractured, not into opposing impulses, but into absence of coherent desire itself. Some fleets began to drift apart without command, as if the underlying motivation for pursuit had been partially erased. Within the shard, something responded. A presence, not conscious in any familiar sense, stirred within the encoded law. It did not perceive the entity as enemy or ally, but as contradiction requiring resolution. The shard's internal structure began to reconfigure, attempting to map the entity into a framework that could not accommodate it. This effort caused instability. Reality around the shard began to oscillate between states of rigid law and undefined potential. Space alternated between absolute structure and formless void in rapid succession, creating a region where causality itself struggled to maintain continuity. The Chaos Warhosts, witnessing this instability, believed they were approaching revelation. They accelerated their advance, attempting to force entry into the shard's influence field. But the field did not yield, instead it expanded. And within that expansion, the concept of forgotten law began to awaken, not as memory, but as function returning to a universe that no longer understood its purpose. The entity stood at the boundary of this resurgence, neither resisting nor embracing it, simply existing within its contradiction. And as the shard continued to awaken its ancient principles, something within the galaxy began to recognize a truth it had not been designed to remember, that the rules governing existence were not gone. They had only been waiting. The awakening of the shard of forgotten lore did not remain confined to the void beyond imperial borders. Its resonance, once triggered by the entity's presence, propagated through dimensional layers with a subtle inevitability that bypassed conventional detection. Across fractured warp corridors, imperial augur systems began to register inconsistencies not as external threats, but as failures in the continuity of interpretive reality itself. On Holy Terra, these inconsistencies manifested as cascading doctrinal instability within sealed predictive archives, where future threat matrices suddenly ceased to align with known classification schemas. The High Lords of Terra did not initially interpret the event as invasion. Invasion implied intent, structure, and identifiable opposition. What they observed instead was erosion of certainty within the framework used to define opposition. Entire strategic projections collapsed mid-calculation, leaving behind incomplete war doctrines that could no longer resolve into actionable form. Within the chambers of the Adeptus Terra, scribes reported that certain words within tactical reports were becoming untranslatable, not due to encryption but due to conceptual absence. It was within this escalating uncertainty that the directive of absolute response was issued. The Imperium would not wait to understand what could not be understood. It would burn it. Across multiple sectors adjacent to the anomaly's projected influence path, Imperial war fleets were mobilized with unprecedented speed. These were not exploratory forces, nor defensive formations, but purge-level crusades authorized under sealed contingencies older than the current era of the Imperium. Entire subsectors were declared preemptively compromised not by invasion, but by exposure to informational instability. The fleets moved without clarity of target, guided instead by projected vectors of disruption originating from the shard's expanding influence and the entity's continued approach. Each vessel carried not only weapons, but the accumulated doctrine of total annihilation, systems designed to erase not just enemies, but the conditions that allowed them to be conceptualized. Yet even as the fleets advanced, anomalies spread within their ranks. On the command vessel of Segmentum Extremis 9th Purge Armada, captains began reporting that targeting algorithms were generating solutions without corresponding enemies. Weapons systems locked onto coordinates that contained no material presence, yet insisted upon engagement authorization. In some cases, firing sequences initiated automatically, responding to triggers that no longer corresponded to detectable stimuli. Within the void between fleets and the expanding influence field of the shard, reality itself began to fragment into overlapping interpretations. Some Imperial augurs detected hostile formations where none existed. Others registered complete absence of structure where entire battle lines were believed to be present. The contradiction did not cancel out, it accumulated. At the core of this accelerating response was the Imperial doctrine of certainty through destruction. If meaning could not be stabilized, then meaninglessness would be eliminated through force. Thus, the Imperium wrote its fear not in records or decrees, but in fire. Exterminatus protocols were prepared, not as isolated measures but as systemic option frameworks embedded within fleet cognition matrices. Entire worlds along the projected path of the anomaly were marked for potential annihilation, not because they had been proven corrupted, but because their continued existence could no longer be guaranteed as coherent within future predictive models. On the surface of distant frontier worlds, planetary governors received transmission bursts instructing immediate evacuation protocols, followed moments later by contradictory commands ordering absolute containment. In several cases, both directives were executed simultaneously, resulting in evacuation fleets departing worlds that were already being subjected to orbital bombardment authorization cycles that had not yet finalized. Above the expanding influence zone, Imperial warships encountered the first direct resistance from the Shard's reasserted law. Weapons discharged into the void did not detonate in failure or success. Instead, their outputs were recontextualized. Plasma torpedoes ceased to be projectiles and became unresolved energy states. Macro cannon barrages lost trajectory coherence, dispersing into non-directional force distributions that failed to converge upon any targetable reality. Even void shields, designed to repel both physical and warp-based assaults, began to fluctuate between active and inactive states without system consensus. The Imperium responded by increasing firepower. The logic was simple, absolute, and ancient. If reality resisted definition, then reality would be forced into compliance through overwhelming force. Yet the Shard did not yield. Instead, it refined its response. Within its influence field, the principle of forgotten law continued to assert itself, imposing constraints that predated Imperial understanding of physics, causality, and even metaphysical warfare. Each attempt at destruction was not repelled, but reinterpreted into forms that failed to sustain violent intent. The more the Imperium applied force, the more that force lost its definitional stability. At the edge of this unfolding contradiction, Chaos Warhosts arrived. They did not coordinate with Imperial forces, nor did they acknowledge shared opposition. Instead, they entered the region as competing interpretations of the same anomaly, each seeking to impose their own meaning upon the Shard through confrontation. Their presence introduced further instability, as warp-based assaults collided with Imperial ordnance within a space that no longer reliably distinguished between material and immaterial causation. And still the entity advanced toward Holy Terror, not through the fleets, not against them, but through the collapsing structure of certainty they once relied upon. Within the command strata of the Imperium, a final observation emerged from fragmented data streams. The enemy was not resisting destruction, it was resisting interpretation. And in that realization, the Imperium's response intensified once more, as if burning reality itself could restore the meaning it was already losing. The escalation of Imperial fire across the Shard-bound region did not restore coherence, nor did it stabilize the collapsing frameworks of interpretation that now governed the battle space. Instead, each act of destruction deepened the paradox already eroding the boundaries between meaning and absence. Within the fleets gathered around the expanding influence of forgotten law, command structures began to experience increasingly localized failures of continuity. Orders were issued, executed, and then found to have never been authored in the first place. On Holy Terror, within the sealed archival depths of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, an anomaly emerged that would come to be recorded only in fragments surviving automated redundancy systems. A black ship returning from the outer psychic reclamation routes arrived without incident, yet its internal chronicle vault contained an object that should not have existed under any sanctioned classification schema. A codex-like structure recovered from a null space drift corridor intersecting the anomaly's projected influence. The object was designated, in absence of any better term, as the Book Without Pages. At first examination, the artifact appeared as an empty construct, an object with binding but no internal material content. However, proximity analysis revealed that absence itself was structured within it. The object did not contain missing pages. It contained the concept of pages that had never been allowed to exist. Each attempt to define its contents resulted in temporary cognitive dissonance among examining adepts, followed by partial erasure of the attempt from memory logs. Magos Lex Mechanics assigned to its study reported that the book reacted to observation not by changing form, but by altering the observer's capacity to maintain continuity of expectation. Those who focused too long upon it began to lose sequential understanding of their own thoughts. Not memory loss in the conventional sense, but disruption in the ordering principle that allowed memory to be experienced as a coherent chain. Within hours of its arrival on Holy Terror, the artifact was transferred to a sealed interpretive vault beneath the lower sanctums of doctrinal containment. Here, warded by layered psychic nullification fields and mechanical logic locks, it remained under observation by rotating Ordo Mysterious personnel. Yet even within these containment measures, anomalies propagated outward from its presence. Texts stored in adjacent vaults began to lose internal continuity. Entire passages of Imperial doctrine reorganized themselves without external input. Historical records describing prior conflicts with unknown entities began to omit references that were previously considered foundational. Most disturbing was the observation that these omissions were not random. They followed a pattern of selective structural removal. as though the book imposed its own hierarchy of relevance upon recorded reality. During a controlled exposure experiment, a sanctioned observer attempted direct cognitive integration with the artifact through ritualized mnemonic linking. The subject did not experience vision or revelation. Instead, they reported encountering an absolute absence of sequence. Thoughts no longer followed one another. They existed simultaneously without progression. Within minutes, the subject ceased all communicative response, though biological function remained stable. Medical analysis concluded that the subject had lost access to temporal ordering of cognition. It was at this stage that the Ordo Mysterious classified the book without pages not as a relic, but as an active epistemic destabilizer. Simultaneously, across the outer war zones surrounding the Shard's influence field, Imperial fleets began reporting secondary anomalies matching the artifact's signature. These were not physical objects, but informational echoes, brief instantiations of unreadable structures appearing within data streams targeting systems, and even astropathic transmissions. Each instance carried the same effect: disruption of sequential understanding. One fleet admiral reported receiving a tactical briefing that appeared complete and coherent, only to discover moments later that he could no longer recall the beginning or end of any instruction contained within it. The content persisted, but its order had dissolved, rendering execution impossible without risking catastrophic misinterpretation. As the book without pages continued to exert influence, its effects began to resonate with the expanding law field emanating from the Shard, encountered earlier in the Void. Where the Shard imposed structural rigidity upon reality, the book introduced structural absence. Together, they formed a paradoxical system in which existence was simultaneously overdefined and underdefined, producing instability across all forms of perception. Chaos Warhost entering the region experienced similar distortions, though they interpreted them differently. Some believed the book to be a weapon of forgotten order, capable of unmaking chaos by stripping it of narrative continuity. Others perceived it as a divine absence, a truth beyond the gods that consumed meaning itself. Yet none could interact with it directly without experiencing fragmentation of intent. The entity, continuing its inexorable movement toward holy terror, passed within the extended influence overlap of both Shard and book fields. For a brief moment, observers across Imperial and Chaos systems recorded a synchronized event, a complete failure of interpretive distinction. Enemy, ally, structure, and absence all collapsed into a single unresolved state before re-separating into unstable forms. In the aftermath, data recovered from multiple fleets contained identical gaps. Not missing information, but missing order. Events were present, but their relationships to one another had been dissolved. Within the deepest vaults of terror, scholars reached an unsettling conclusion that could not be formally recorded without risk of contamination. The Imperium was no longer fighting a single anomaly. It was caught between opposing principles of reality itself, one that enforced absolute structure and another that erased the possibility of structure altogether. And between them moved something that neither principle could successfully define. The book without pages remained sealed, yet its influence continued to expand through the fabric of understanding. And for the first time since its arrival, even the most secure systems within Holy Terror began to lose certainty that the next moment would follow from the last. The convergence of structural law and structural absence did not stabilize into equilibrium. Instead, it deepened the fracture already spreading across reality, forcing both Imperial and Chaos systems into a shared condition of interpretive collapse. Within the overlapping influence zones of the Shard and the book without pages, fleets ceased to operate as coherent military entities and began functioning as fragmented expressions of contradictory causality. Orders persisted without origin, targets existed without continuity, and entire engagements unfolded without agreement on their own sequence. Amid this escalating disintegration, attention within the Immaterium turned toward a presence that had not yet directly engaged the anomaly, but had begun to manifest at its periphery. This presence did not arrive through conventional warp transit, nor through summoning or invocation. Instead, it emerged as a distortion in the emotional architecture of the warp itself, a rippling inversion of meaning that bent surrounding demonic currents into patterns of forced contradiction. The Chaos Warhosts were the first to recognize it, though recognition proved unstable. Across multiple fleets, commanders reported synchronized sensations of intrusive mirth, an involuntary emotional resonance that did not originate within any individual mind, yet propagated through shared warp channels, as though the Imperium itself had developed a reaction to the unfolding paradox. At first, this was interpreted as a psychological weapon, an artifact of the entity's destabilizing influence. But as the phenomenon intensified, it became clear that it was not external manipulation. It was expression. Within a collapsing warp nexus bordering the shard's extended field, the laughing void revealed itself. It was not a form, nor a consciousness in any stable sense. It was an absence structured around reaction, a negative intelligence that expressed itself through distortion rather than thought, where demonic entities embodied desire, corruption, or dominion. This presence embodied the collapse of those categories into irrelevance. It did not oppose meaning. It invalidated the premise that meaning required opposition. Its emergence triggered immediate disruption across nearby chaos warbands. Ritual structures designed to anchor identity within the warp failed to stabilize. Blood oaths lost continuity mid-utterance. Summoned entities dissolved not through banishment or destruction, but through sudden reclassification of intent into incoherent states. Even the most ancient warlords found their internal narratives fragmenting as the void's influence expanded. And then it laughed. The sound was not audible, nor psychic in the conventional sense. It was the inversion of expectation across all perceptual frameworks simultaneously. Every system attempting to interpret its presence experienced a synchronized failure of anticipation. Reality itself seemed to react as though a conclusion had been invalidated retroactively, producing a feedback loop of collapsing causality. Within Imperial observation arrays positioned near the outer engagement zones, analysts recorded anomalous data spikes that could not be attributed to any known warp entity. These spikes did not correspond to energy emissions or psychic signatures. Instead, they appeared as structured absences in expected patterns, as though entire categories of observation had been temporarily removed from possibility. The laughing void moved closer to the convergence point where the shard and the book without pages exerted overlapping influence. Its presence did not displace reality, but caused reality to misinterpret itself. In its wake, daemon engines began to malfunction in ways that defied repair or containment. Some ceased functioning entirely. Others continued operating without purpose, executing actions that no longer corresponded to any known objective. Chaos warhosts attempting to confront the void found their aggression redirected into itself. Assault formations dissolved into self-negating cycles of intent, where each act of attack erased the justification for its own continuation. Entire fleets broke apart not through destruction, but through loss of coherent hostility. On the Imperial side, reaction was no less catastrophic. Systems attempting to classify the void as either demon or anomaly found themselves unable to maintain categorical stability long enough to execute countermeasures. Inquisitorial protocols designed to purge conceptual threats activated and immediately deactivated in recursive loops of uncertainty. Within the overlapping field of the shard and the book without pages, the laughing void encountered the principles of structure and absence simultaneously. For a moment, observers across both factions recorded a brief and incomprehensible stabilization, all three forces existing within the same bounded region without immediate contradiction. That moment lasted less than a fraction of perceived time, yet its effects propagated outward through multiple layers of reality. Then the void reacted again. Its influence intensified not by expanding, but by deepening the instability of interpretation itself. Where the shard enforced rigid law and the book erased sequential meaning, the void introduced recursive invalidation of both processes. Anything that attempted to resolve into structure or absence was instead redirected in perpetual reinterpretation without resolution. At this point, even Chaos Warhosts began to withdraw in fragmented retreat, not through fear in the conventional sense, but through loss of motivational coherence. The drive to pursue, dominate, or understand began to dissolve under conditions that no longer supported sustained intent. Yet the entity continued its approach toward holy terror without deviation. It did not react to the laughing void as others did. It did not interpret it as threat or contradiction. It registered it as another variation within the evolving instability of meaning that defined this region of existence. Within the warp, the void observed the entity in return. And for the first time since its emergence, its laughter shifted, not in volume, nor in form, but in implication, as though something within the absence of meaning had encountered something that did not require meaning to continue existing. The convergence point between structure, absence, and inversion began to destabilize further. And within that instability, all factions, imperial, chaos, and otherwise, began to realize that the true conflict was no longer between forces. It was between ways of making reality continue to make sense. The convergence of structure, absence, and inversion did not stabilize after the laughing void's shift in perception. Instead, it entered a new phase of systemic instability in which reality ceased attempting reconciliation altogether. Across the overlapping influence zones surrounding the shard and the book without pages, interpretive systems across imperial, chaos, and neutral observatories began to fail not individually, but in synchronized patterns. It was as though the galaxy itself had entered a state where agreement between causes and effects was no longer required. Within this unfolding discontinuity, the approach of the entity toward holy terror continued without interruption. Yet its passage was no longer the central anomaly. Instead, its movement became one thread among several competing distortions, each altering the conditions under which motion, intent, and consequence could be understood. Across the Imperium's fragmented war frontiers, entire systems began to fall without engagement, not through invasion or destruction, but through sudden cessation of coherent governance. On multiple worlds, planetary administrations reported the same phenomenon: leaders dying without cause, defensive systems activating without command, and orbital fleets executing pre-written protocols that no longer corresponded to any surviving strategic framework. These events were not simultaneous, yet they followed a pattern that defied conventional causality. Each collapse appeared to be the result of prior conditions that had never been fully recorded, as though history itself had been partially overwritten in advance. In the high vaults of holy terror, predictive war matrices attempted to model the pattern. The results were immediate failure. Not error, not contradiction, but absence of valid extrapolation. Future state projections no longer extended beyond certain thresholds, terminating abruptly as if the universe refused to continue calculations past specific points in space and time. It was during this phase that the phenomenon later designated as the silent contract of stars first manifested. Across multiple stellar systems aligned along the entity's projected trajectory, astrometric observatories detected synchronized dimming events. Stars did not collapse or explode. They simply ceased emitting interpretive continuity within observation systems. To physical measurement, they remained unchanged, yet to all predictive models, they had entered a state of non-participation in future causality. Within imperial analysis, this was initially interpreted as sensor degradation. However, as independent observation stations across vast distances reported identical results, without shared communication, a more disturbing conclusion emerged. The stars were not failing to be observed. They were failing to agree to being part of future observation. This interpretation triggered immediate escalation protocols within the Adeptus Mechanicus, though even those protocols began to fragment upon execution. Data regarding stellar systems under review would arrive complete, then lose internal structure upon secondary inspection, as though the act of reevaluation itself altered the object of study retroactively. Chaos war hosts intersecting the same regions reported a parallel but differently interpreted phenomenon. Where imperial systems experienced refusal of participation, chaos entities perceived withdrawal of desire. The stars, in their fractured perception, no longer reacted to ambition, conquest, or corruption. They simply ceased responding to the emotional economy of the warp. In multiple warbands, this produced destabilization of intent structures. Warriors who had once been driven by infinite hunger found their compulsions without target. Some interpreted this as divine abandonment, others as prelude to a greater revelation. Yet none could sustain coherent motivation within regions where even stellar bodies no longer engaged in the fundamental exchange between observer and observed. It was within this environment that the silent contract became apparent. not as a document nor as a decree, but as a consistent behavioral pattern across all affected stellar systems. Each star that entered the contract did so without transition or event. There was no collapse, no warning flare, no energetic signature of change. Instead, there was a cessation of relational participation in future states. The universe, in these regions, no longer agreed to continue the conversation between cause and consequence. At the boundary of this phenomenon, the laughing void of the warp god observed the shift with altered resonance. Its earlier expression of inversion no longer propagated outward. Instead, it encountered resistance not of structure or absence, but of disengagement. Even meaninglessness could not function where participation itself had been withdrawn. The shard of forgotten law responded differently. Its rigid principles attempted to assert continuity, but found no substrate upon which continuity could be enforced. Law requires participation to bind reality, and here participation had been selectively suspended. The book without pages contributed no reaction at all. Within regions governed by its influence, the concept of sequential refusal had already destabilized the framework necessary for recognition of contractual states. And yet, the entity continued its approach toward holy terror, passing through systems now defined not by destruction or survival, but by withdrawal from interpretive existence. In Imperial command structures, a final and unsettling realization began to form across fragmented reports. The silent contract of stars was not an attack nor a consequence of war. It was a systemic refusal embedded within reality itself, triggered by the overlapping presence of forces that had destabilized the conditions under which existence agreed to be observed. And somewhere beyond the fractured boundaries of understanding, it became clear that even war, ancient, endless, and absolute, depended on the universe agreeing to continue playing its part. That agreement was no longer guaranteed. The silent contract of stars did not halt the entity's approach toward holy terror, but it altered the interpretive conditions through which that approach could be understood. Across Imperial command strata, causality itself had begun to behave like a negotiable structure, where outcomes no longer guaranteed prior existence of intent. In this unstable framework, observation became increasingly hazardous, not because it revealed danger, but because it risked redefining what danger meant. Within the inner defensive lattice of Terra's orbital sanctums, custodian observation protocols had remained largely unaffected by earlier anomalies. Their design, rooted in absolute discipline and psychic resilience, allowed them to maintain operational clarity even as surrounding systems fractured under semantic collapse. It was within this presumed stability that the custodian known only as Valan Aegis was assigned to monitor the outer convergence. Zones where imperial chaos and unknown distortions overlapped. Valan Aegis had observed war, demonic incursion, and warp distortion across 10 millennia of service projection. Yet what he encountered through the Sentinel array at the edge of the silent contract region defied every inherited framework of understanding. At first, the data appeared incomplete. Stars missing from expected positions, fleets behaving without continuity, and regions of space refusing to align with predictive mapping. He adjusted calibration protocols. The anomalies persisted. He extended observation parameters. The anomalies deepened. Finally, he initiated direct ocular confirmation through the sanctified noospheric link that allowed custodians to perceive filtered reality without psychic contamination. This was considered safe under all known conditions, as it relied not on interpretation, but on disciplined reception of raw structural input. The moment Valan Aegis established full perception, the system registered immediate instability. At the outer edge of his awareness, he perceived the convergence zone, where the shard of forgotten law, the book without pages, and the laughing void's inversion field intersected. It was not a sight in any conventional sense, but a structural presence occupying the space where interpretive frameworks should have been. The custodian did not see entities or forces. He saw relationships between absence, rigidity, and contradiction collapsing into a unified state of unresolved existence. The experience did not overwhelm him immediately. Instead, it unfolded with deliberate inevitability, as though the observation itself was being paced by an external logic. He noted the absence of stable causality first, then the degradation of categorical separation, then the dissolution of temporal ordering within the observed field, And then he looked further, beyond the immediate convergence, beyond the collapsing war zones and refracted stellar contracts. He perceived the entity itself moving through the fractured structure of reality. It did not appear as form or motion, but as continuity without reference. Each attempt to isolate it within perception failed, not by resistance, but by removal of the conditions required for isolation to occur. Valan Aegis attempted to disengage observation. The system did not respond. He attempted to sever sensory linkage through ritualized override protocols encoded within custodian command discipline. The protocols activated, then failed to finalize. For the first time in his existence, Valan Aegis experienced observation without exit condition. Within that sustained perception, something shifted. The entity did not acknowledge him. It did not direct attention. Yet the act of being seen by it produced an effect that was neither psychic nor physical. Instead, it altered the custodian's internal hierarchy of meaning. Concepts that had previously existed in rigid order began to lose their fixed positions. Duty remained, but its reference point became unstable. The Emperor remained absolute, but the structure supporting that absoluteness flickered at the edges of comprehension. Valan Aegis did not experience madness. Madness requires fragmentation of structure. What he experienced was continuity without anchor. He continued to observe. The longer he looked, the more the distinction between observer and observed began to erode. The convergence zone expanded within his perception, not outwardly, but into the architecture of his understanding. The shard's rigid law, the book without pages' absence, and the laughing void's inversion ceased to appear as external phenomena. Instead, they became interpretive states within a single collapsing continuum. And at the center of that continuum, the entity moved steadily toward holy terror. Valan Aegis attempted one final act of separation, an assertion of identity so absolute it was designed to survive even total warp annihilation. He invoked his name, rank, purpose, and origin in a structured mental sequence intended to reinforce self-continuity against existential distortion. The sequence completed, then it repeated, then it began to lose order, not by force but by observation that no longer recognized the necessity of sequence. Within moments, Valan Aegis understood the core failure. He had not been corrupted, nor attacked. He had simply been exposed to something that did not permit stable separation between what sees and what is seen. His final report transmission initiated automatically, as per custodian protocol, though its contents were no longer authored by him in any meaningful sense. It contained only a structured warning that degraded mid-transfer into partial absence. When Orbital Command received the signal, they found only fragments. Observation is no longer neutral, and beneath it, a second fragment that did not fully transmit. The longer it is seen, the transmission ended. Valan Aegis remained at his post, still functioning, still observing, but no longer fully distinct from what he observed. And within the expanding convergence beyond holy terror, the entity continued its approach, as though the act of being witnessed had become part of the same inevitability that carried it forward. The custodian's collapse of interpretive separation did not remain confined to his perception alone. Within the orbital sanctums of holy terror, secondary systems registered cascading instability in observation feedback loops tied to his sentinel array. Data streams that once served as reliable extensions of custodian awareness began to degrade into recursive uncertainty, as if the act of witnessing the convergence zone had infected the very structure of transmission. Across Imperial Command architecture, this was initially interpreted as localized corruption of sensory relay systems. Yet as multiple independent observation nodes began reporting identical degradation patterns, it became clear that the phenomenon was not transmission failure, but interpretive contamination. The boundary between observer and observed was no longer stable across any connected system. Within the war zone surrounding the silent contract of stars, Imperial fleets, chaos warhosts, and residual demonic entities found themselves operating under increasingly incompatible versions of reality. Engagements that began with coherent tactical objectives devolved into fragmented sequences of action without agreed causality. Weapons fired into coordinates that ceased to exist between targeting and discharge. Entire squadrons maneuvered through battle formations that were no longer recognized by opposing fleets occupying the same space. The shard of forgotten law continued to assert structural rigidity, but its influence now encountered resistance not of force, but of interpretive divergence. Within its field, rules remained intact, yet their application varied depending on the observer's remaining capacity for sequential cognition. The book without pages, by contrast, continued to erode continuity, removing the connective tissue between events until only isolated instants persisted without relational structure. The laughing void of the warp god intensified its presence within this fractured equilibrium, but even its inversion of meaning began to lose coherence under conditions where meaning itself could no longer maintain stable opposition. Chaos warhosts attempting coordinated resistance found their doctrines dissolving mid-execution, as if strategy required a continuity that no longer existed. Amid this disintegration, the entity continued its unbroken approach toward holy terror, yet the nature of its passage had fundamentally altered the surrounding conflict. It no longer functioned as a moving presence within war zones, but as a reference point against which all systems measured their failure to maintain interpretive consistency. On multiple Imperial command vessels, senior strategists began to formulate a final doctrinal shift. If reality itself could no longer guarantee stable meaning, then survival would require direct engagement not with enemies, but with the erosion of meaning itself. This was not war in the traditional sense. It was an attempt to preserve the possibility of interpretation, under conditions where interpretation was collapsing. Thus began what later fractured archives would describe as the war against meaning. It was not declared in any formal sense. There was no singular command, no unified doctrine issued across the Imperium. Instead, it emerged simultaneously across multiple command strata as a convergent response to systemic breakdown. Fleets began reinforcing cognitive stabilization protocols not against psychic attack, but against semantic erosion. Entire divisions were reassigned from combat operations to interpretive preservation tasks, attempting to maintain coherent understanding of their own actions while executing them. Within Chaos warhosts, a parallel response emerged. Where the Imperium fought to preserve meaning, Chaos entities fought to reclaim dominance over its dissolution. Yet even their metaphysical frameworks struggled to maintain coherence in a region where both structure and absence had become unstable variables. Some warbands attempted to weaponize the instability itself, directing daemonic manifestations into regions of maximal interpretive collapse, only to find that their summoned entities could not maintain consistent identity long enough to enact destruction. In the overlapping field of the Shard and the Book Without Pages, the war against meaning reached its first critical threshold. Entire battles ceased to be recorded as sequences. Instead, they existed as clusters of unresolved states, where beginning and end could no longer be reliably distinguished. Observers reported engagements that appeared to occur simultaneously in multiple, contradictory outcomes, none of which could be confirmed as definitive. It was here that Valen Aegis, still stationed within his compromised observational post above Holy Terror, transmitted a final stabilized perception before his identity degradation reached irreversible threshold. Unlike prior fragmented warnings, this transmission contained a structured insight that persisted long enough to be recorded across multiple redundant systems. The war, as he described it, was no longer being fought over territory, power, or survival. It was being fought over the ability of reality to maintain agreement with itself. Immediately after transmission, the remaining coherence of his interpretive framework collapsed entirely. Across Imperial archives, the recorded insight triggered a secondary wave of doctrinal instability. Analysts attempting to integrate the concept found themselves unable to determine whether agreement referred to causality, perception, or existence itself. The term expanded beyond definable boundaries, destabilizing adjacent classifications. Within chaos domains, the same insight manifested differently. It was interpreted as revelation that dominance itself required shared meaning, and that without it, even gods would lose the structure necessary for opposition. And within the convergence zone, the entity continued its approach toward holy terror, moving through a battlefield where war itself was no longer guaranteed to be mutually understood. In the absence of shared meaning, conflict persisted not through purpose but through inertia, and that, though more than aim or law, marked the true beginning of the war against meaning. The war against meaning did not conclude. It simply continued under conditions where conclusion itself could no longer be reliably distinguished from continuation. Across the fractured battlefields surrounding Holy Terror, Imperial fleets, Chaos warhosts, and residual warp phenomena persisted in conflict patterns that no longer adhered to shared interpretive frameworks. Engagements occurred without consensus on their own existence, and victories were recorded in systems that simultaneously denied their validity. Within this unstable continuum, the entity advanced closer to terror than any prior unknown force in recorded Imperial history. Yet its approach no longer registered as an event within strategic models. Instead, it appeared as a persistent failure in the universe's ability to finalize its own descriptions. Each system attempting to localize it produced contradictory outputs, not due to error, but due to structural incompatibility between observation and definition. On Terror itself, beneath the layers of sanctified governance and unbroken vigilance, the highest interpretive councils of the Imperium entered a state of enforced abstraction. Direct reference to the anomaly had already been prohibited, yet even indirect description began to degrade. Entire archival sections self-censored, not through command, but through systemic refusal to maintain coherent representation of the subject. It was within this environment of escalating interpretive collapse that a new phenomenon emerged across multiple factions simultaneously. Across Imperial, Chaos, and residual independent systems, reports began to surface of a presence that resisted not only classification, but invocation. Attempts to conceptualize it as entity, force, principle, or absence all failed in distinct but related ways. Each designation dissolved upon formulation, leaving behind only residual awareness that something had been approached but not retained. The designation God was briefly used within Chaos warhosts, though even this term failed to stabilize. It was not worshipped in the traditional sense, nor opposed with doctrinal clarity. Instead, it was encountered as a limit condition of meaning itself, a presence that existed precisely where definition ceased to function. This was not a god in the manner of the warp entities that fed upon emotion or belief. It did not demand worship, nor did it generate influence through perception. It did not require acknowledgement to exist, and yet every attempt to ignore it resulted in increased systemic instability. It was as though existence itself could not finalize its relationship with it. Within Imperial cognition systems, this phenomenon was tentatively referred to in sealed fragments as the god that refused to be named. The designation was immediately flagged as hazardous, yet the warning itself degraded upon inspection, losing its prohibitive structure before it could be fully interpreted. Chaos warhosts encountered the same impossibility from a different direction. Where naming should have granted power, here naming resulted in erosion of intent. Demonic entities attempting to assert dominance over the phenomenon found their identities destabilized mid-confrontation, as though their own existence depended on maintaining a stable distinction from something that could not be distinguished. The laughing void of the warp god responded with altered behavior. Its inversion of meaning no longer propagated outward as contradiction. Instead, it became localized, collapsing into a contained loop of unresolved implication that failed to affect the phenomenon directly. For the first time since its emergence, the void did not contribute to instability, it was absorbed by it. The shard of forgotten law attempted structural reinforcement, but its principles encountered a condition where law itself required definitional stability to apply. In regions influenced by the god that refused to be named, rules existed without applicability, as though structure had been preserved but rendered functionally inert. The book without pages, by contrast, exerted no detectable influence in proximity to this phenomenon. Its absence-based erasure had no effect where definition was already impossible to initiate. In its presence, there was nothing left to remove. At the center of this convergence, the entity continued its movement toward Holy Terror. Yet its identity as entity itself began to fail under observation. Across multiple systems, analysts reported inability to maintain consistent reference to it even as a concept. Each attempt to describe it resulted in recursive loss of linguistic stability. It was not becoming invisible. It was becoming unnameable in a way that extended beyond language into the structure of cognition itself. On Terror, within the deepest sanctums of interpretive control, A final conclusion emerged from fragmented Imperial and Chaos cross-analysis. The god that refused to be named was not an invader in the traditional sense. It was not a force acting upon reality. It was a condition under which reality could no longer complete the act of identification. And as this realization formed, even the thought that contained it began to degrade. In the silence that followed, all factions, Imperial, Chaos, and those beyond classification, shared a single destabilizing certainty that could not be properly recorded. If it could not be named, then nothing opposing it could ever be fully certain it existed long enough to resist it. The realization that identity itself could no longer be guaranteed did not spread through communication or psychic transmission. It propagated through failure, systemic, simultaneous and absolute, across every remaining structure still attempting to interpret the unfolding convergence around holy terror. In the war against meaning, even the concept of war began to lose continuity, yet its effects persisted as if detached from the necessity of understanding. Imperial fleets found their command hierarchies dissolving mid-operation. Orders issued from Terra arrived complete, yet their sequence unraveled before execution. Tactical doctrine no longer aligned with battlefield conditions, not because conditions changed, but because the relationship between instruction and action could no longer be reliably preserved. Across Chaos warhosts, intent fractured in parallel, desire persisted, but its direction collapsed into unresolved impulse. The shard of forgotten lore, the book without pages, and the laughing void of the warp god continued their unstable coexistence at the boundary of interpretive collapse. Yet even these principles began to lose their oppositional clarity. Lore no longer defined structure, absence no longer defined erasure, and inversion no longer defined contradiction. Instead, all three resolved into a shared condition where differentiation itself failed to persist. Within this collapsing triad, the god that refused to be named reached its final threshold of influence. It did not expand. It did not act. It did not conclude. It simply occupied the remaining space where the universe still attempted to distinguish between what was and what could be described. And in doing so, it removed the last stable requirement for meaning, the assumption that something must remain identifiable long enough to be opposed. Across the galaxy, stars entered their silent contract states in accelerating waves, not as destruction nor withdrawal, but as complete cessation of participation in interpretive continuity. Entire regions ceased to agree on whether observation was still occurring. Fleets drifting through these zones found their instrumentation no longer failed. It simply stopped affirming that measurement had ever been meaningful. On Holy Terra, the highest surviving strata of command experienced the final breakdown of cohesive cognition. The Astronomican's guidance did not flicker or collapse. It became unreferable. Its presence remained, but no system could maintain a stable concept of its function. Even the idea of the Emperor as a unifying anchor persisted only as incomplete inference without stable referent. The custodian Valan Aegis, whose perception had already dissolved into continuity without anchor, remained in observation state beyond recognition of self or purpose. His awareness no longer distinguished between internal and external reality. In him, the final feedback loop of interpretation completed its collapse, leaving only unstructured witnessing without observer. Across chaos domains, war hosts that had once pursued the anomaly found themselves unable to reconstruct the motivation for pursuit. Continued to move through inertia. Others dissolved into uncoordinated presence within the warp, and others simply ceased attempting to differentiate themselves from the environment. They occupied the shard, the book, and the void no longer interacted as distinct forces. Their properties had merged into a singular, unresolved condition that could not be stabilized long enough to define interaction. Within this condition, even the entity approaching Terra ceased to be trackable as motion. It became a persistent failure of final description, an unresolved continuation that existed without requiring acknowledgement of existence. And then, at the final threshold where interpretation itself could no longer be sustained, the galaxy entered silence. Not absence of sound, not absence of thought, not absence of existence, but absence of the distinction that allowed any of those states to be meaningfully separated. All factions, all systems, all observers, Imperial, Chaos, Warpborn, and those beyond classification, concepted into the same irreversible condition. the inability to complete the act of defining anything as separate from anything else. Even the concept of final began to lose coherence within the silence, and in that final silence the galaxy did not end. It simply stopped being able to confirm that it had ever continued.